Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here today, and especially here in this city, which for me is ground zero for my belief in our capacity for transformation. For me as an individual, and for us as a profession. All those achievements that I am so proud of really have their roots, in a way, at the shelter that some of you will visit this afternoon, not too far from here, in one of my darkest moments in this profession. I rewrote this presentation this morning because I was just so moved by being here and talking to this group about this topic. This was the first time that I was in the New York Times. I was the veterinarian that recommended the euthanasia of those 1,000 dogs and cats at the Animal Foundation. I was part of a team from the Humane Society of the United States that was consulting with the shelter here. And there was such dire and widespread disease that it was the only recommendation that I could think to make to get control of the situation. It was my first consultation with a shelter. I was trying to learn how to do it so that we could bring that to more shelters as a shelter medicine program. And I wrote part of this report. These are my words, and it's hard for me to admit to this group that that was the best I could do. That was my assumption, that if an animal shelter maintains a municipal contract, and therefore, this was my belief, cannot limit its intake, it will require the euthanasia of healthy adoptable animals in some cases, particularly those species and breeds for which intake numbers far exceed adoptions. Pretty different from the beliefs that underlie the talk you heard this morning, right? I am the same me that I've always been. I have the same passion for cats that I've had since I learned how to speak and start requesting a pet cat. It was the best I could do. Time passed, and the wonderful thing about being a consultant with shelters is that shelters ask us to help solve their problems, but in the process, we learn how they are solving the problems. And every shelter that we visit, so from there, we built our consultation practice. We wrote, inspired by that, we wrote the guidelines for standards of care in animal shelters. We partnered with other university programs, with other national animal welfare organizations, and we crisscrossed the country, seeing both where shelters were struggling and solutions that surprised us. Some of the programs that Joe described, some of the programs that you've heard about, some of the programs that you're implementing, we saw them pop up here and there in small shelters, in big ones, in rural shelters, in urban ones, in shelters with big fancy buildings, in shelters with small terrible buildings. And fast forward, the next time I was in the New York Times was quoted in this article, this opinion piece, about how smart animal shelters aim for zero kill. And that's really the practices that we've come to include in our consultations, that were incorporated into the guidelines for standards of care, that were built into the Million Cat Challenge, that we had the privilege of partnering with Humane Network and working with the shelter here again 7 years later, that partly culminated. I was in the audience when this announcement was made, and of course you'll hear more about how that story continues to play out. I have no doubt that they're going to reach that goal well ahead of schedule, and also was built into the Million Cat Challenge, which was a 5-year campaign for North American animal shelters to save 1 million more cats, more cat lives over their own baseline, each organization's baseline, before joining the Million Cat Challenge. Do you all know how that one played out? Did we make it? I just checked the counter this morning. Shelters in the Million Cat Challenge have increased their life saving by 1,896,034 cats as of this morning. That counter is now rolling at the rate of over 1,600 cats an hour. At shelters in the Million Cat Challenge, at the 1,400 shelters in the Million Cat Challenge, if they had been euthanizing cats 24 hours a day, they are euthanizing 69 fewer cats an hour. 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, plus a bonus for leap year. So in the time we've been sitting here already this morning, over 100 fewer cats in shelters have died. Not because there was a giant infusion of new money into our profession, not because all of a sudden cats became responsible about their own breeding and behavior, not because human beings changed and became more compassionate in the last 5 years, but because our mind shift shifted. We rethought our programs. We reimagined how we could do things. We reinvested the resources that we were already investing in the work that we do to create massively different results. Oh, there's my little cheat sheet. So with that said, I'm going to roll the clock back. Over 25 years ago, that's me. I don't know if you can see it. For one thing, I have the same haircut. In those days, I got it cut by the dog groomer where I used to work. It was a puppy cut number 3. Shout out to Maddie. It was the same cut that we gave schnauzers. And sometimes she put a little bow on my head so you could tell I was a girl. I remember the pride I felt when I put on that badge. And I remember the sense of responsibility that I felt bringing that cat into the shelter. And I remember my confidence that I was doing the very best I could, even though at that shelter at that time, that cat had a 1 in 3 chance of leaving the shelter alive. I believed that bringing in the cats that came to us from our community, regardless of whether we could guarantee them a home based on their temperament or just the number of cats that were coming in, was the very best way we could meet the really important goals that we had. I've worked for an animal shelter. I was a field services officer. I wanted to reunite lost pets with their owners. Good goal, right? I needed to resolve community members' concerns and complaints. For one thing, otherwise we would hear about it from the Board of Supervisors, and I would lose my job. For another thing, though, otherwise people would do even worse things. You know, I saw what happened when people got frustrated and they shot cats, or they drowned cats, or they poisoned cats. So I wanted to be the one to resolve their concerns in a positive way. I wanted to find new homes for cats that needed them. I wanted to protect the welfare of free-roaming and pet cats. I was the one who picked up cats hit by car on the road. I was the one who saw the animals that were the victims of neglect and cruelty and starvation. I was the one that saw cats that were eaten by coyotes. So I wanted to protect those cats, and I wanted to protect people's pet cats from the diseases that could be carried and transmitted by free-roaming cats. And we were perched right on the edge of the Monterey Bay. My other favorite animal is sea otters, and I wanted to protect them from the diseases that can be transmitted by cats, like toxoplasmosis. We did wildlife rehab. I saw the harm caused to birds by free-roaming cats. I wanted to protect them. I was there for all animals, and this, to me, was the best way to serve all of those goals. And you can see that reflected in my recommendation to the Animal Foundation back in 2007 too, right? To admit animals in excess of the number that can be adopted out and euthanize the difference as kindly and humanely as you can without permitting them to suffer. But as I spent the next 10 years traveling across the country as a shelter consultant and at the university reading the latest and best research on the dynamics of community cat populations in North America, I came to an unsettling realization, which is that there were some things about cats that made them different from dogs that made my assumptions about the best way to manage them not correct. Here's one difference between cats and dogs. If you text your dog, hey, how are things? They're like, oh my God, hi, so much stuff is happening. There was a bird outside, and I barked at it. It flew away. I was so scared. If you text your cat, hey, how are things? So that's one difference. Here's another difference. There's about the same number of pet dogs and cats in the United States. Lots and lots, 80 to 90 million. There is no free-roaming, unowned dog population that looks the same as the pet dog population, right? If we see this dog running around, we don't have the idea that we should use the same tools for management that we use for pet dogs. We don't have the idea that, well, if we have a leash law, or a law against abandonment, or a law against feeding, that we could thereby eliminate problems associated with coyotes. We know that spay-neuter programs aren't going to target our coyote population. We would never think of sending animal control officers out to round up coyotes and house them in our kennels, see if they tame down. If they don't, turn them into barn coyotes. We don't do it. That would be crazy, right? Not because we necessarily have so much compassion for the coyotes, but because we know instinctively that would not work out well for us or the coyotes. The thing is, there are between 30 to 80 million free-roaming, free-breeding cats that look just like our pets. And for decades, since the Charleston Animal Society was founded and before, we have tried to use the same tools to manage that population that have been successful in managing the pet cat population without recognizing there's not an owner on the receiving end of those programs to take advantage of that. So here's what we know about the cat continuum. 74 to 86 million pet cats, the vast majority of whom are sterilized. Then 30 to 80 million community cats, about 2% of whom are sterilized. So who's contributing to pet overpopulation there? It's the unsterilized ones. Learned that in vet school. And then there's there may be some level of social, right? They may have started out like this, and then they got out, and they turned into this. They might start out like this, and then make the jump into that. Or they may be born in the wild and truly feral. What we know about the unowned cats is that although a lot of attention gets paid to the big aggregates of cats that live in colonies and have one formal feeder, and there's big trays of cat food, and there's poop everywhere, and there's nuisances, more than 95% of free-roaming unowned cats, or partially owned cats, live in just 2s and 3s. They're not part of colonies. And so even our TNR programs that have been colony-focused have failed to reach those cats that are just living out there in people's yards and alleys and behind dumpsters doing their little cat thing. And so what does this mean for our best approach to resolve complaints and nuisances caused by cats, to reunite cats with their owners, to find new homes for cats, protect cats from suffering, and reduce the risks and harms created by cats. Now that we know that the vast majority of the population that we're dealing with is a free-roaming, free-breeding population without an owner attached. I'm going to break that down one by one. First of all, resolve complaints. This was a study that was done a few years ago that asked people, what would you do about unowned cats in the street? 81% would say leave the cats alone if the alternative was to trap and kill the cats. Only 14% are even open to the solution of trapping and killing the cats. There was a non-committal group called Other. I just can't choose. So, as a taxpayer-funded organization in my shelter, when I was an animal control officer, I was failing to offer an option for 81% of the taxpayers that supported my shelter, because the only option I could offer was one that was unacceptable to the vast majority of people in my community. So I heard from the ones who were good with trapping and killing the cats, because that was the option that I was able to offer. But it left invisible the 4 out of 5 people who really preferred something else. And what it left them was with no tool, really, to manage the nuisance. So we didn't have an alternative option. And the thing is, when somebody called me about Rocky Raccoon getting into their trash can, I didn't say, like, let me come right out and pick him up and bring him into the shelter. Not because I loved Rocky Raccoon, but because, why? Yeah, what'll happen if I pick him up? Like, the trash can is like, yeah, kill the raccoon. What's going to happen? Another raccoon will come, right? As long as there's not a lid on that trash can, another raccoon will come unless I am able to round up all of the raccoons. And so the real solution has to be figuring out, why is the raccoon coming? And resolve the situation at its root. But when I was just sweeping up cats from the street, people were never pushed to have a deeper conversation with me about, well, why did the cat come? Why is he leaving little footprints on your car? Why is she pooping in your garden? What can we do to actually resolve that situation? So by creating sort of an easy but ineffective solution, I actually undermined my ability to truly, in a long-term way, resolve complaints and concerns caused by cats. But what about this? Surely, rounding up cats that had just showed up in people's yards or were found on the street, somewhere where they seemed like they shouldn't be, I was helping at least to increase the possibility that they would eventually get back home. And this was one of those things, it just made me put my head down and cry when I read this article. Because it showed the methods by which lost cats are reunited with their owners. And that green piece of pie, 8% by a call or visit to the shelter. The other 92% by some means that involves the cat remaining in the neighborhood where it was lost. 72% of cats that are ever reunited with their owners are reunited because they return home on their own. And so by admitting cats that were free roaming before really encouraging people to look for the owner in the neighborhood of origin, we were reducing as much as tenfold the likelihood that that cat would ever get back home. So, okay, what about finding new homes for the cats that really need them? Well, for one thing, I came to recognize we're not the only game in town, right? How many of you have gotten a cat from a source other than adopting from an animal shelter? And we work with animal shelters, right? Me too. People get cats from all sorts of places. So for one thing, just a cat not being in an animal shelter doesn't mean it's not going to get a home. Actually, the largest source of cats in this study was adopted it as a stray that just showed up. Cats self-rehome. But also importantly, when 70% of cats are getting rehomed through another mechanism than the animal shelter, if we're so overwhelmed by intake that we can't support those cats and getting vaccinated and sterilized and identified in their new home, then we are not really sustainably rehoming cats. So we need to redirect our efforts at the whole system of rehoming cats in the community so that if someone adopts a cat as a stray, or if they get it from their neighbor that had a litter of kittens, then that kitten and the mother also get sterilized, and we can do that if we're working within our capacity. And this is just an example of a shelter that really focused on finding homes, not for all the healthy free-roaming cats in the community that already had homes, but just for the ones that had lost their homes or were the victims of cruelty or neglect. So they made a policy of all healthy free-roaming cats just got sterilized. They just actually got referred to another group and sterilized and returned. And so this is their intake and their live release. Wasn't too bad. Intake of a little over 1,800 and live release closing in on 1,400. So euthanizing only about 500 cats a year. But after the change, this was only owner surrendered and victims of neglect and abuse and cruelty. The hardest cats took in a little over 400 and only euthanized 57 cats. So much higher rate of success in finding homes for cats that truly needed them, even when they had health challenges, even when they had been abused and neglected, and so had some behavioral challenges that went with that as well. So we can find new homes for the cats that really need new homes better when we focus our efforts and don't try to find new homes for the cats that already had homes. But what about this one? What about protecting the cats from all the harms? Is that a concern for people here? And some of you may already be sold on what I'm saying, but I'm talking through it so that you also have talking points for the concerns that you'll hear from your constituents and stakeholders. Remember, I was the one who picked them up, hit by car. But when we really look at what the data tells us, we recognize that we don't have an opportunity to find the cats that are really at risk, those healthy cats that I was going around and scooping up. They might have been hit by a car the next day, but they might well have lived another 10 years out there, right? I couldn't pick the ones that were immediately at risk until there was some evidence that there was really some kind of imminent harm that was about to happen. And when we look, less than 1% of more than 100,000 cats that were picked up healthy and brought to TNR clinics were euthanized for humane reasons. And this was all the way from the southern tip of Florida all the way up into southern Canada and the northern U.S. Hot, cold, moist, dry, in between. Cats are incredibly adaptable. Less than 10% of cats entering shelters are sick and injured. And the annual survival of semi-owned cats, which is cats that have some access to resources, some access to a food source, which by definition is any cat that's coming into a shelter healthy, is 90%. That's pretty good. That's kind of similar to a live release rate that's sometimes equated to no kill, right? Our world is about as good as a shelter that might be defined as no kill. They're doing okay out there, and we can make them do even more okay with just a little help. And when it comes to looking inward, when it comes to looking at like what I found at the Animal Foundation in 2007 when they were having that terrible outbreak, how do we do in protecting cats from suffering when we are overwhelmed by the numbers that are coming in? Have you ever been in the position of feeling like you couldn't provide the right care for the cats that were in your shelter? You don't deserve to be in that position. You don't deserve to have to walk in the door of your shelter and see a cat who's scared, who's sick, who's got litter kicked into her food and water bowl, who's going to get upper respiratory infection because the shelter's too crowded and you don't have time to do what you know you should do. So when we admit cats in excess of the number that we can really care for and release alive, we are not serving that goal of protecting cats from suffering. So we come down to this last tough one. Raise your hands if this is like really the difficult one for, if not for you, from your stakeholders, like what about the impact of cats on birds? Yeah, so for a good handful of you, this is the one that's really hard to get past. And this has been a controversy in Nevada, right? This just came out, the One Health approach to toxoplasmosis, and it had a whole thing about how some university shelter medicine programs are advocating radical approaches to cat management that are going to unleash toxoplasmosis onto the land. And for those of you who don't know, toxoplasmosis is a disease that can have serious health consequences for wildlife and for human beings. And cats are the only true shedder. So it's the only species in which it can complete its life cycle. So that's a big concern with cats. This was from the New York Times a while ago. We have a long history, the New York Times and I. That cuddly kitty is deadlier than you think. Like, cats are killing literally billions of birds and animals, like more birds than there even are in North America. You know, regardless of what the true science is, they kill a lot of animals and birds. It's true. I saw it as an animal control officer. I picked up those birds. Here's a little reality check, though. Euthanizing a cat is not magic. Just as removing a raccoon is not magic. Doesn't make there be one last raccoon. Because if you remove one cat, what will happen? 2 cats. We'll find a way to replace that 1 cat plus some, right? So there's a threshold that you have to reach in order for removal, euthanasia, move them to an island, put them into homes, whatever it is. In order for removal to be effective, you have to reach a threshold. One paper showed at least 57% of cats have to be either captured and neutered or removed by lethal control. Another paper, at least 50%. It's lower than the 75% estimated to be required for TNR to be effective, but it's still not nothing, right? 50%. How many cats did I say there was? 30 to 80 million free-roaming cats in the United States alone. We'd have to be pulling then 15 to 40 million off of the streets. That's a lot more than what we're doing right now. And importantly, removal short of eradication has no benefit. Instinctively, you could actually recognize that, right? But I'm going to go through a little case study. This is a little hard to look at, but I think it's important because you'll hear the, sort of anti-TNR people, bird advocates, talking about how, well, there should be responsible animal control programs and humane euthanasia. And it sounds good. It sounds like if you remove some, there will be somewhat less impact of cats. Does that make sense? This is a success story about eradication of a population of cats on this sub-Antarctic island off the tip of South Africa. Pretty forbidding place, but it had some ground-dwelling petrels there, birds, that were very vulnerable to predation by cats because they had evolved in the absence of any predator like that. This population of cats originated as the offspring of 4 cats that were brought onto the island to keep the lighthouse keeper company. And they did what cats do in the face of an available food source. They bred to the carrying capacity of that island to a starting population of about 3,400 cats, 11 by 7 Mile Island. In the first phase of this eradication effort, about 100 cats were trapped, infected with panleuk, and released by helicopter across the island. Ouch, right? Ouch. But what are shelters being asked to do when we're asked to euthanize healthy cats as a way of controlling cat populations? Ouch. Ouch. It's no different. I mean, it's a little different. But in terms of emotional impact, when you ask a shelter to take in a cat that's beyond their capacity to care for and adopt out, ouch. Let's acknowledge that's a hard thing to ask. That killed about half the cats. The food was still there. Half the cats were still there. What happened? They bred back to the carrying capacity of the island. So when we do removal short of eradication, it does no good whatsoever. Here's what it really took. 8 full-time teams of 2 hunters hunting day and night for 7 years with over 14,000 hours of effort. It wasn't enough. 5 full-time teams of trappers with over 3,000 traps running over 5 years, with over 1,300 traps placed during the peak year of effort. It wasn't enough. Poison injected into 30,000 day-old chicks distributed across the island by helicopter. And cats were eliminated after 14 years. It's not going to happen. It was the largest and only successful campaign of its kind. We cannot offer our communities the illusion that we can or ever would accomplish this. And if we do anything short of that, we are wasting our time, we are wasting our resources, we are wasting the euthanasia of cats because they will breed back to the carrying capacity of the environment. Not only might this be ineffective, what we're doing, what we're asked to do as a way of controlling cat populations, there's strong evidence that it's worse than doing nothing at all. So this was a study done in Tasmania where, again, there's a lot of ground-dwelling, endangered native mammals that evolved outside the presence of cats. There's a lot of motivation to eliminate cat populations. Intentionally replicated realistic efforts that could be achieved by natural resource managers, which is a lot like what could be achieved by an animal control program, right? Even pretty intensive 6 to 16 nights of trapping per pulse, every 1 to 4 months for a year. And then they actually monitored by remote camera to count the number of cats present before and after trapping. And this is important because if you think that trapping is working because there's fewer cats trapped per effort, it's only because you're trapping the dumb and the brave, right? But the wily and the fearful might still be out there. And in fact, that's what they found. This was not what they expected. The relative abundance and activity of feral cats increased in the cull sites, even though the number of cats captured per unit effort declined, increased by up to 200%. Why? Who can guess? Yeah, in the back. It actually was in areas where perhaps people weren't dumping cats, but the food remained. And so either there was more immigration or the cats bred. So that they destabilized the age structure, cats bred back to the carrying capacity environment, and there was more cats present than before. Ouch! All that effort has the potential to increase the impact of feral cats in open populations. What do we have in Nevada? Open populations, right? The definition of open populations. Even worse, the decline in numbers of cats trapped could have led to an erroneous conclusion that the culling was effective if we had not been able to monitor the population independently. So, by admitting healthy cats in excess of the number that we can adopt out and care for, we don't resolve complaints, we don't reunite cats with owners, we don't do our best job of finding new homes for the cats that really need them, we don't do our best at protecting cats from suffering, and we don't decrease the risk to wildlife and public health. This is just not a good use of resources. Euthanizing healthy cats, even if you don't care about the cats, it just doesn't make good economic or biological sense. And that is such good news because it means we don't have to do it anymore. Anything else that we can do has the potential to be at least equally or more effective. So what could we try? And I know you have all probably heard about this, but when I saw this headline, San Jose's animal shelter is among the first in the country to try a new approach to dealing with feral and stray cats. Instead of euthanizing those that aren't adoptable, they just spay or neuter them and release them back to the vacant lot or back alley from which they came. And when I first heard about this program, the animal control officer in me was like, say what? Like, you mean no matter what? Like, even if the person was mad, even if that's not what they wanted to have happen, like, you're just going to spay them and put them back? That is not a good idea. But the shelter medicine specialist in me did a little reading. And I also had the opportunity of seeing the first program along these lines in Jacksonville, Florida. And I was shocked by the fact that in spite of my belief that it couldn't work, it actually did work incredibly well. So I went back to the literature and figured out, like, why would that be? And here's a little thought experiment that I came up with to explain to myself and ultimately potentially to others why it might be that it actually worked not only as well, but better than what they had been doing previously. We know that 1 in 7 people on average in the United States feeds cats that they don't own on purpose. In addition, quite a number of people who just like put dog food out on the back porch. Right? And this is not something that it's possible to regulate because feeding of cats can be done rapidly under cover of darkness, right? You just like dart out, slash open a bag of cat food, boom, you're done. So we're not going to stop that, realistically. And just imagine, we know that litter-bearing mammals breed in proportion to the amount of food available in the environment. And so imagine, for the sake of this exercise, for every bowl of food, a cat can have 1 kitten. And there's usually multiple cats sort of within, they have a 2-kilometer or so radius when they're intact. So there's more than 1 cat accessing these bowls of food, whether this kind-hearted person knows it or not. And so there's 3 female cats. There's 6 bowls of food equivalent. There's a little R on each cat because they're unvaccinated. They could get rabies. And there's an R and a T on the little kittens because they can get toxoplasmosis. That's a disease that cats get the first time they eat infected prey. And then they shed for about 2 weeks, and then they develop pretty strong immunity. So shedding is either eliminated or reduced thereafter. So it's mostly a disease of young cats. So for every bowl of food, each cat can have 2 kittens. And so we have 6 little rabies and toxoplasmosis vectors then to threaten our society or come into the shelter. So what if we remove that cat? Now, it doesn't matter if we rehome her or put her in a barn or euthanize her from the sake of the ecosystem. We didn't have a conversation with this person who's feeding the cat. We didn't get the bowl of dog food off the back porch. We didn't put the lid on the trash can, right? The food's still there. The other 2 cats are still there. So they now have 3 bowls of food each, and they have 3 kittens. And we still have 6 little vectors running around and 6 kittens coming into the shelter. We didn't do much, did we? And I'll make these slides available for everybody, in fact, to use and edit for you to deliver to your own communities if you like. So what if instead, that animation again, watch closely. I spent a lot of time on that. We sterilize her, we ear tip her, we vaccinate her for pan-luke and rabies, greatly increasing her well-being and survival, and we put her back. We don't need to interrogate anyone in the community to make sure she's being fed. We know from her body condition. If she's in good body condition, she knows where the food is. She goes back and she keeps eating it. Magically, she reduces the reproductive carrying capacity of the environment. We have no other tool to do that except to put sterilized cats back in areas where they were in good body condition and they know where the food is, to keep eating that food as a service to society. Now what happens? No new food available. Now things really are different. The next year, 4 kittens instead of 6. The risk of rabies is only 4 worth. The risk of toxoplasmosis reduced by 33%. Intake into the shelter the next year down, and more resources to put into other programs. That was the theory. Here is the practice. Here's a paper published a few years into that San Jose City program. Euthanasia due to upper respiratory infection, down 99%. What does that speak to? That speaks to ending suffering in shelters. That speaks to good welfare for cats. That speaks to portals between the two cages, so every cat has a living room separate from the bathroom. That speaks to one of our key goals. Euthanasia down 75%. That speaks to another key goal for us as animal welfare professionals, why we get up in the morning, right? Cats picked up dead on the street, down 20% with no change in field services. That's really interesting because that speaks to reduced risk for cats, perhaps reduced roaming because territory isn't opening up, because cats aren't breeding as much, because the carrying capacity has been reduced, and cat and kitten intake down almost 30%. And this was even in the face of long-standing, very low-cost, $5 spay-neuter programs and long-standing traditional TNR programs directed at colonies. So evidence that truly this method is the most effective method that we have. It's not perfect, but the most effective method that we have of truly reducing the harms and risks created by free-roaming cat populations. And this is a study that came out of UC Davis that, looking specifically at toxoplasmosis, infection prevalence was significantly lower for managed feral cats, 17%, than for unmanaged feral cats, 73 to 81% prevalence for toxoplasmosis. So again, it's not about achieving perfection. It's not about eradicating cats from the face of the earth. We can't do that. We know that. It's about mitigating the harm. Managed, spayed and neutered, fed is way better than unmanaged. So, how do we do all of these things? We rewrite the script so that instead of animal control officers bringing cats in, animal control officers are out there returning. This is a picture of an animal control officer cat returning a cat to the location where it was found. This is the real key to truly effective and humane community cat management. Start with the assumption that healthy free-roaming cats already have a home until proven otherwise. Either that's someone that actually thinks that is their cat and it has a name and its name is Henry, or it's a free-roaming cat that has 7 different homes, but it's worked something out in the community, and the only thing that we will accomplish by removing it is disrupting that ecosystem and creating space for increased breeding and relocation of cats. Relieve every cat possible of their reproductive parts so they can inhabit their home without making more of themselves. And save the shelter for animals that have truly lost their home and need a new one. It's a simple equation, and it really is kind of as simple as that. So these are the basics of what we call return to field. It targets healthy, free-roaming, unidentified cats. So these are not people's own pets. They've come to the shelter and say, I can't keep this anymore. They are sterilized, vaccinated, and returned to the location found. They are not relocated. And importantly, regardless of what the finder had in mind, because we don't let the finder determine whether we'll euthanize or adopt out a cat, and the finder also doesn't get to choose whether we consider a third option as appropriate. And we don't need to identify the person feeding the cat. It can be done through a shelter or a partner organization. Importantly, it doesn't have to be all or nothing. You can start small with this. You can start with just one neighborhood. That's how it started here in Las Vegas, with just one area where they piloted it and then extended it. And in our shelter, we don't have a big conversation with people about it. There just used to be a form that people signed saying, I'm giving up this cat. I testify that I didn't steal it from anyone and it hasn't bitten anyone in the last 10 days to my knowledge, and I understand it may be adopted or euthanized. And they just added some more tiny print saying it may be adopted, euthanized, or returned to the location found. And people are like, and they just sign it. Because it turns out that people just trust us to say, what should happen with cats. And so when we communicate this with just confidence and conviction, they're mostly like, okay. Just a little bit about which cats qualify for this. So no imminent danger or environmental concern at the location of origin. And that's not just like, it's at a busy intersection and it's doing fine. Like, I live near a busy intersection. I'm obsessed with getting 10,000 steps a day. So I step around all the time, just at random like a crazy person. And there is a cat that lives at the corner of a, like 8 lanes in every way intersection. And I've been seeing him every day for the last 2 years. And he's just like, I wouldn't see him if he hadn't figured out to stay away from that intersection, right? But if they just like leveled the warehouse where the cat was living, you know, or the house just burned down and the people are gone and there's a cat that's just like there and meowing, yes, you know, that's the cat that should come in. But no imminent danger. It's not an environmentally sensitive area. Feral adults and kittens that are too old to be tamed and there's not another live outcome, for sure. You know, we're looking then for options that are better than death, and that's pretty easy to say. But also, more and more, I believe, friendly adult cats, unless there's a clear indication that the owner, like the person has been watching them for a couple of weeks, already put it on nextdoor.com, talked to their neighbors, put it on Facebook, the cat's getting skinnier, and they really are a truly lost cat. But this is just something that somebody posted, a map of where a cat was lost and where a cat was found, like a long way away. So if they just asked their neighbors, they would never realize that the cat had actually been lost. But the cat was just doing its little cat thing, going this short route across backyards. That was one that was reunited with his owner, but he was friendly. If he had just been put back where he was found, he just would have gone home the next day. They found him the very day he disappeared from home. So when a cat is friendly and in good body condition, that just means it's likely it already has someone who loves it, right? And so the best thing to do in most cases is still put that cat back. We just did a free, low-cost spay neuter and might give someone the experience of having a sterilized cat for the first time in their life. Friendly older kittens, only if there's not enough homes for adoption. So those are the ones that are relatively likely to not be someone's pet. That's an accidental birth, and they could use a new home if you can give them one. But just remember, free roaming doesn't equal unloved. Even like no clear evidence of ownership doesn't mean that cat doesn't have a name and a value. Often to one of those, a member of an underserved community, an older person, a person without a car, a person who doesn't speak English, who really cares for that cat. This is a person who is profiled in HSUS's Pets for Life program after he had passed away. But he would roam the streets, sometimes after midnight, looking for others to help. He kept a record of each cat's history and medical issues. Even if you don't know that person, when a cat's in good body condition, there's evidence that someone cares about that cat. And the best thing you can do is support them by sterilizing that cat so that it can have a healthier and safer life. And then just a couple of FAQs to finish up. In case this is a question, we do close to 1,000 cats over the past year. Shelter we work with requires that cats are combo tested. Would you recommend continuing this practice? Short answer is no. We don't recommend testing for feline leukemia or FIV. Partly, we just recognize more and more, like, we do not understand FELV at all. And we're just not that worried about FIV anymore, right? In healthy cats. And we're not doing return to field on unhealthy cats. And we know that FELV is transmitted, the vast majority of transmission is mother to kitten, and FIV is mating and fighting. And when we sterilize, well, we really eliminate that mother to kitten thing and the mating thing, and we really reduce the fighting thing. And so sterilizing cats is just a vastly better way. Just a quick one on, like, people don't want the cats back. Lots of ideas for this, but, you know, just going back to our raccoon, empower your team to help people solve their real problems, and they'll love you for it more. This is just some examples of cat deterrence. You can offer help. You can rent out cat deterrence. You can send your animal control officers out to set them up, help solve problems, and recognize that every once in a while, yeah, it's not appropriate. There's 20 cats, and you save your barns and your working cat homes for the situations when cats really need them. And then you can have enough for those times when it really isn't appropriate to put the cat back. You can find documented impact on decreasing citizen complaints, and it makes sense, right? Because we're solving the real problems. And because sterilized cats are just less of a nuisance. And I'll just close with, are any of you in the position where you don't have a vet, you can't do this in-house? So a handful of you. And so one other option, either if it's legally prevented for you to do this as a shelter, or you just don't have a vet or a clinic in-house, is just don't take them in. Just stop. And that's what the shelter I showed earlier, so the Chico City shelter, it's part of the police department, so, definitely an animal control public shelter. And they just said, you know what, it doesn't serve any of our purposes as a city to take them in, and so we're just not going to. And in that void, a TNR group sprang up, and they gave people other ideas for how to solve cat problems. And here's just an example of a way of getting, if you can't just stop, you could start charging a fee to bring in a stray cat. It's well accepted that we charge fees for a lot of activities that we actually want people to do, like get their cat spayed or adopt an animal from us. It's very reasonable to think if you're one of the ones using the shelter as a way to manage your cat nuisance concerns, that you might have to pay a fee. So this shelter started charging $90 for stray cat intake. It was enough to fund sterilization, and it dropped their intake dramatically, allowing them to sort of reorient their resources towards prevention programs. Recognize that the groundwork really has been laid. I know that some of you are in very rural communities where this is going to be a new message. But if you get the message right, I think you'll find that people will be more open to it than you expect, especially if you communicate it with the conviction of like, yeah, this is just what we do now. And find the right messenger. If you're animal control, if your officers are out there, sometimes partnering with the rescue group can be effective, especially for the people who are feeding the cats and who are worried about the cats. And I just want to end with this quote. Once we fully implemented our program, the only real regret we had was that we didn't start it sooner. Honestly, this is the feedback that we get the very most about this approach to managing community cats. Not only from the shelter staff that were sort of bought into it in the first place, but oftentimes from the people who were the biggest skeptics to start with. And I'm guessing some of you have already had that experience. So I'll close this slide. I can't remember, does anyone recognize this hammer? This picture was taken in Las Vegas when we were back from that shelter visit to see how much better things were. So it was like just the difference between getting on the right side of the equation, getting on the prevention side, instead of just getting hit with the problem after it's already happened. So I had to show that. And I'll just leave this here. You can email info@millioncatchallenge.org if you want a copy of these slides. I also have a video of that animation. So if you want to show the animation of the feeding and breeding and the bowls of cat food, I can send you like a narrated copy of that video. Thank you so much. Thank you for welcoming me back to Las Vegas.